So, conservative politics in Australia is currently fracturing in a way that we've never seen. And it's because of an inability of Australian conservatives to come to a consensus point over whether or not Australian conservatives should engage in the sort of right-wing populism that has been growing in the United States and in Europe. And the reason that there is a divide is because there's one core question, and that is that sort of populism even possible in Australia? So let's actually look at the conditions necessary for the rise of populism, like looking at best, most accurate case studies, probably the United States and the United Kingdom. One, we have Donald Trump co-opting an existing political institution, the Republican Party, to launch his brand of populism. And then in the United Kingdom, we have Reform UK, an entirely new political party that is taking over the entire political scene and is currently ahead in the polls for the next general election. Look, it might be a bit of a generalization, but I think to summarize what happened in these two systems, and I think it's pretty similar what happened here, is that an increasingly under pressure middle class in the current neoliberal economy became more and more apathetic towards politics, and then the people left in politics became more radicalized and more furious with the system that existed. The United Kingdom, for example, in their most recent election where Reform really actually got a foothold and got seats in Parliament for the first time in 2024, that election saw a 7% drop in turnout from the previous election in 2019. A pretty good indication of voter apathy taking over in that system. And look, Donald Trump in 2016, the reason that he won, even though he polled as the most unpopular presidential candidate in the history of modern polling, the reason that he won was because he was able to mobilize and talk to uneducated white voters in a way that no politician ever has. It was his superpower in terms of breaking through the political scene. Now, that is not me attempting to disparage his voters. Non-college educated people are not inherently worse than any other group in society, but you can't deny that Trump's appeal to that group is incredibly unique, and his ability to get them to a group that traditionally wouldn't participate in politics anywhere near what they are now. His ability to get that group to turn out and to vote is unprecedented. In a system where voting is optional, Donald Trump's superpower politically is his ability to convince that demographic that they have to get out and vote at rates that they have never done so before. So in these similar systems where populism has arisen, is it fair to say that something similar could happen in Australia? Could Pauline Hastie's, Nampa Price's and Barnaby's dreams come true? And could Australia get swept up in a similar populist fervour? I would say absolutely not. It's not impossible, and I'll talk about the ways in which it potentially could happen later in the video, but we have a number of safeguards when it comes to our democracy, which, while not perfect, certainly stop us from driving off the deep end into political insanity most of the time. First guardrail, compulsory voting, which we have to be grateful for every single day. Forcing everyone to engage in politics and express their opinion on political parties is something that is intrinsically valuable and contributes massively to political stability in this country. It has always been my take that if only the politically engaged actually went and voted, that would be a horrific system. When you force people that aren't that politically inclined to engage in the system, they are very, very unlikely to pick a political party that is extremely radical or promising some enormous, unreasonable fantasy change. They will tend to vote for political parties that have reasonable expectations. And considering that and how people vote, we also have to look at the voting system, which ranked choice voting, our preferential voting system, is something that protects us from political insanity. If you look at the United Kingdom now, with its asinine first-past-the-post voting system, where the person with the most votes wins, the Reform Party that's currently taking everything over and dominating the political scene and is ahead in the polls is only getting, at best, 33% of the vote, according to current polling aggregates. Nowhere near enough to say that it represents a majority of people. 70% of people in the UK are supporting a party other than them But because of the political system, they are almost certain to win, despite the fact, at best, they're going to get a third of the vote. For example, the Liberal Party, no matter how well One Nation's doing, as long as they're not overtaking them in the polls, the Liberal Party, if it's so decided, would be able to operate a campaign without really giving any policy concessions, with the confidence that One Nation's preferences are still going to flow to them. They don't have to engage with or make deals whatsoever with the extremist elements of the political spectrum, because they know that at the end of the day those preferences are going to come back. So it disincentivizes political parties from directly engaging with extremist elements. Now, minor parties can, of course, threaten to preference in another direction. But realistically, if somebody is voting one Greens, if we're looking at the left of the spectrum, and the Greens then direct preferences in their how to vote cards to the Liberal Party, I don't think too many Greens voters are going to take that advice at hand and preference the Liberals ahead of the Labour Party. And I think something similar is on the other side. Not too many One Nation voters are that fond of Albanese, and if One Nation threw some tantrum and said, we are preferencing Labour in our how to vote cards before the Liberals, I don't know how many One Nation voters would be happy directing their preference to the Labour Party. So it's not that big of a threat, at least in my opinion, when we're looking at it in practice. So look, there are some good safeguards in the Australian political system that prevent the sort of populism that we're seeing around the world. But could a takeover, a populist political takeover of Australia's political system still happen? Yes. And if it was going to happen, it would probably happen like this. So the first hurdle that a right-wing populist movement would need to overcome in Australia is to take over the Liberal Party. I know there's talk of One Nation surging and stuff, but realistically, if there's going to be a right-wing populist movement, it's not going to find any success in this country unless it somehow co-opts the Liberal Party as a whole. The reason that I say that is because if you look at the Australian conservative branch of politics, the whole thing, from moderate liberals all the way to the most extreme elements of One Nation, is that there are more people on that side of politics that are comfortable voting for the Liberal Party than there are people that are comfortable voting for a potential expanded One Nation. If you want moderate and centre-right Australians to vote for you, it's much more likely they're going to do so if you co-opt the Liberal Party than if you try to do it under the banner of One Nation. Because as terrible as the coalition and the Liberal branding is at the moment, it is nothing compared to what the average Australian thinks when they think of One Nation. So that potential takeover of the Liberal Party, I think, would come if, and this is a path that is currently possible, if One Nation continues to surge and we see defections like Joyce, we see people within the coalition still like Hastie and Empty for Price, constantly attacking and tearing down the stability of the Liberal Party, just making it like a clown show, and we get to a point where One Nation is polling upwards of 15%, and it's becoming clear that there is a massive defection amongst the party's traditional conservative right-wing base, then you might see the Liberal Party buckle and give in to that pressure and accept that they need to bring that wing back in and become a much more right-wing populist party with somebody like potentially Hastie or more likely Angus Taylor at the helm. That version of the coalition would then, of course, have extremely right-wing people leading it, but its next problem, after it became like an effective buckling to One Nation populist movement in terms of its policies, would actually be getting elected to government, which realistically is on the brink of impossible. Look, Australia, it can of course be said, is living through a cost of living crisis, but at the same time, the Australian people have a tendency, and this is more of a cultural statement than a political one, to see through very obvious bullshit. I think that's part of the reason why Dutton flopped as hard as he did. His nonsensical promises of nuclear power station in your suburb, we will fix the problem by just making petrol cheaper, that sort of campaigning is so obviously dog shit policy that the average Australian, who at least I think is more skeptical of promises than the average Brit or the average American, is going to look at a campaign like that promises the world of right-wing populism and say, that kind of just sounds like bullshit. So realistically, assuming that first thing happens and the Liberal Party is co-opted by its populist elements due to fear of the growth of one nation, if that happens, the only way I could see that version of the coalition and the Liberal Party winning is if the Albanese government somehow completely shat the bed and destroyed its own reputation, either through complete mismanagement of the country or some sort of political scandal, which I think is incredibly unlikely. I mean, it's not going to go back to the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd chaos. I mean, they've reformed the party's rules. Albo is going to be leader as long as he wants to be leader. And Anthony Albanese has a very pragmatic approach to politics, which I know upsets a lot of people who are more to the left of the spectrum, Labour left or the Greens, that he's not more of a incredibly forward-thinking reformer in how he's governed. But the reason that he has chosen to govern that way is for the sake of stability and his goal that we all know he has, which is to be the left-wing version of John Howard, somebody who can be in power for a decade, potentially. So the idea of a hasty or Taylor-led, extremely conservative coalition that is going to alienate even more people than Peter Dutton did, going up against the Labour Party that is more competent than we have seen the Labour Party since probably the 1980s, is genuinely laughable. Look, certain things could change. There could be a dramatic shift in the Australian political landscape. There could be some horrific crisis or disaster that destroys the reputation of the Labour Party. But at the moment, if you look at right-wing populists and the current hurdles they are facing in Australia, it almost seems like insurmountable. We have an electoral system that is designed to keep them out. We have an Australian populace. Population? The Australian populace, yes. The Australian people are inherently sceptical of bullshit promises on grand scales. And we also have a Labour Party that is not the incompetent mess that it was back in the early 2010s and the late 2000s. If you're a right-wing populist and you're looking at the Australian political system and hoping to take it over, my only real word of advice would be good fucking luck.